Picture this, mate. You're standing on a dusty street in Dodge City, 1876. The sun's beating down like a furnace, and you can smell something absolutely putrid wafting from the saloon next door. That's not just stale beer you're smelling. That's human waste, rotting meat, and the sweet stench of gangrene from the bloke who got shot 3 days ago and is still bleeding out in the corner. Your iPhone's dead. No Google Maps, no Uber, no antibiotics, no running water. And you know what the worst part is? You wouldn't last 5 minutes making the decisions these people made every single day. See, Hollywood sold you a lie. The Wild West wasn't cowboys, riding into sunsets and honorable gunfights at high noon. It was a festering wound on the arse end of civilization, where your morning coffee was literally made from burnt acorns. And that was if you were lucky enough to afford acorns. Tonight, I'm going to take you on a journey through the real American frontier. We'll explore the secrets your history teacher never mentioned, the gruesome realities that would make your modern sensibilities curl up and die, and discover why your smartphone would literally make you more powerful than any sheriff, any gunslinger, any cattle baron who ever lived. So settle in, close your eyes, and let's travel back to a time when a simple paper cut could kill you, and often did. The period we call the Wild West, roughly 1850 to 1890, wasn't actually wild because of outlaws and gunfighters. That's tourist rubbish. It was wild because it was a massive social experiment in human suffering, conducted on a continental scale. Here's something they don't teach you in school. The average life expectancy in frontier towns was 26 years, not because of gunfights, those were actually quite rare, but because of something far more mundane and horrifying: disease. Imagine this. You wake up in your one-room shack, and the first thing you do is check if the rats have eaten through your food stores overnight. Not because you're poor. Everyone's dealing with rats. Then you step outside to use the privy, which is basically a hole in the ground that hasn't been cleaned since it was dug. The water you're about to drink has been sitting in a barrel for weeks. It's got a green film on top and you can see things moving in it. But you drink it anyway because the alternative is dying of thirst. And here's the kicker. This water has probably been contaminated by the same privy system that serves 30 other families. Cholera wasn't just a word back then. It was a death sentence that could wipe out entire settlements in a matter of days. And the symptoms? Voice drops even lower. Imagine your body turning itself inside out, literally. You'd lose so much fluid through vomiting and diarrhea that your skin would shrivel like a raisin, your eyes would sink into your skull, and you'd turn blue from lack of oxygen. Death would come as a mercy. But here's where it gets really interesting. The people who survived weren't the tough guys with 6-shooters. They were the ones who understood basic hygiene, mostly women who'd grown up in established settlements, and immigrants who'd survived urban plagues in Europe. Your modern immune system, coddled by vaccines and antibiotics, would be absolutely useless. You'd catch typhoid from the first meal you ate, dysentery from the first sip of water, and tuberculosis from the first night you spent sleeping in a crowded boarding house. Speaking of boarding houses, chuckles darkly. The accommodation situation was worse than any horror film you've ever seen. Picture paying a week's wages to sleep on a straw mattress that's been used by hundreds of previous guests, none of whom bothered to wash. The mattress would be crawling with lice, bed bugs, and occasionally, things that used to be alive but had been there so long they'd started decomposing. And the smell. Christ, the smell. No one bathed regularly because water was precious and soap was expensive. The average person might wash their entire body once a month if they were particularly fastidious. Most people just didn't. They'd layer on more clothes to hide the stench. Here's a lovely detail that'll make you appreciate your shower. The most common cause of death for women in the frontier wasn't childbirth complications, though those were horrific enough. It was something called childbed fever, basically a massive infection caused by unsanitary birthing conditions. Midwives would deliver baby after baby without washing their hands, spreading disease like some kind of medieval Grim Reaper. The infant mortality rate was so high that families wouldn't even name their children until they'd survived their first year. Imagine that psychological trauma, having babies that you couldn't allow yourself to become attached to, because there was a better than 50% chance they'd be dead within 12 months. And this is before we even talk about the violence, the isolation, the complete breakdown of any social safety net. Your supermarket loyalty card would have made you richer than most cattle barons. Your basic first aid knowledge would make you the most sought-after doctor west of the Mississippi. Your smartphone's calculator would revolutionize commerce, and its flashlight would literally be considered witchcraft. Let me tell you about something that happened in 1846, something so disturbing that most textbooks just skip over the details. The Donner Party. You might know the basic story. A group of pioneers got trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains during winter, and some of them resorted to cannibalism to survive. But what you probably don't know is how civilized people just like you, transformed into something unrecognizable in a matter of weeks. George Donner was a successful farmer from Illinois, well-educated, well-spoken, with a loving wife and children. The kind of man who'd probably have a LinkedIn profile today and volunteer at the local Rotary Club. In October 1846, he was making rational decisions about supply rationing and route planning. By December, he was calmly discussing which of his recently deceased companions would provide the most meat. Here's what really happened during those months, the parts they sanitize in documentaries. The group wasn't just snowed in. They were trapped in a psychological pressure cooker that stripped away every veneer of civilization. When the food ran out, they started with their pack animals. Fair enough, right? Basic survival. But when the animals were gone, they moved to leather. They boiled their shoes, their belts, anything made from hide. They chewed on it for hours, trying to extract some nutrition from what was essentially processed skin. The taste was apparently indescribable. Imagine chewing on a wet boot for 6 hours and you're getting close. Then came the human meat. The first person to die naturally was an elderly man named Bayless Williams. And here's where it gets really dark. They didn't just reluctantly consume the body. They organized it. They discussed which parts would be most nutritious, how to preserve the meat in the snow, how to ration it fairly among the survivors. William Foster, one of the expedition members, became the group's unofficial butcher. He developed techniques for processing human bodies that he'd learned from preparing livestock. He knew how to separate joints, how to preserve organs, how to make the meat last as long as possible. And here's the part that'll really twist your stomach. They started making hierarchical decisions about who to eat. The elderly and sick were considered better sources of meat because their deaths were expected anyway. But when people started dying of starvation, the group began making more calculated choices. Louis Keseberg, one of the last survivors, was found by the rescue party sitting in a cabin surrounded by human bones, calmly eating what remained of Tamsin Donner, George's wife. When the rescuers arrived, he offered them some. The rescue party later reported that Keseberg had developed a taste for human flesh. He preferred it to beef, he told them. He'd learned to prepare it in different ways. Roasted, boiled, even dried into jerky for long-term storage. But here's what'll really keep you awake tonight. When the survivors were eventually rescued and returned to civilization, most of them went on to live completely normal lives. George Donner's surviving children grew up, got married, had families of their own. They attended church picnics and community gatherings. They just never talked about those months in the mountains. William Foster, the man who'd become an expert at butchering human corpses, opened a successful ranch in California. Louis Keseberg, who'd developed a preference for human meat, became a respected businessman in Sacramento. The human mind's capacity to compartmentalize horror is absolutely terrifying. These people had crossed a line that most of us can't even imagine approaching, and then they just integrated back into society like nothing had happened. Your moral certainties about right and wrong, about what you would and wouldn't do to survive, those are luxuries of the well-fed and comfortable. Put you in a situation where your children are literally starving to death, where you haven't eaten protein in 3 weeks, where you're watching people die around you every day. You'd probably make the same choices they did. And that's the most disturbing part of all. Now let's talk about what happened when you got sick or injured in the frontier. Because this is where your modern sensibilities would absolutely shatter. Picture this. You're a cowboy, and you've just been thrown from your horse. Nothing dramatic. You see this in movies all the time, but this time you've broken your leg. Clean break, nothing too serious by today's standards. A few weeks in a cast, some physiotherapy, and you'd be good as new. But this is 1875, and you're 3 days ride from the nearest town. The first problem is transportation. Your companions can't carry you. They need to keep moving to avoid whatever spooked your horse in the first place. Maybe it was Apache raiders. Maybe it was a territorial dispute with another ranch. Either way, staying put means everyone dies. So, they fashion a crude stretcher from tree branches and rope, and they start dragging you across the desert. Every rock, every bump, every uneven patch of ground sends lightning bolts of agony through your shattered bone. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is what happens over the next few days. Without proper immobilization, your broken bone starts tearing through muscle and skin. What should have been a clean break becomes a compound fracture. You can see your own bone sticking out through the meat of your thigh, white and splintered and absolutely crawling with flies. And the smell. God, the smell. In the desert heat, your wound starts to go septic almost immediately. It's not just the infection, it's the combination of blood, exposed bone marrow, dying tissue, and whatever bacteria happens to be floating around in the air. Your leg starts to smell like rotting meat because, well, part of it literally is rotting meat. When you finally reach the nearest settlement, let's say it's Tombstone, Arizona, the local doctor takes one look at your leg and reaches for his bone saw. No anesthetic, no antiseptic, no antibiotics. They hold you down with leather straps and pour whiskey down your throat until you're barely conscious. Then they start cutting. The bone saw makes a sound like, imagine someone slowly grinding through a tree branch with a rusty hacksaw. It takes about 15 minutes to cut through the bone, assuming the doctor doesn't get tired and need a break. Half the patients die from shock during the procedure. Another 30% die from infection over the next few weeks. The ones who survive are left with a stump that never quite heals properly, constantly oozing pus and blood, attracting flies and maggots. But let's say you're one of the lucky ones. You survive the amputation, and the wound eventually heals. Congratulations. You're now disabled in a society that has absolutely no support system for disabled people. You can't work cattle, you can't farm, you can't do any of the physical labor that frontier life demands. Your options are basically begging for scraps or putting a bullet in your head, and this is just from a broken leg. Something that would be a minor inconvenience today was essentially a death sentence in the frontier. Here's Dr. George Goodfellow, one of the most respected physicians in the American Southwest during the 1880s. His medical bag contained whiskey, opium, a bone saw, some rusty forceps, and what he called his bullet spoons, tools for digging bullets out of gunshot wounds without anesthetic. His success rate for major surgery was about 15%. Dr. Goodfellow once wrote in his journal about treating a man who'd been shot in the abdomen. The bullet had perforated his intestines in multiple places, causing massive internal bleeding and infection. Modern surgery could fix this relatively easily, but in 1883, Goodfellow's only option was to cut the man open and sort of poke around, hoping to find the holes. The patient remained conscious throughout the entire procedure, screaming and begging to die. Goodfellow couldn't find all the perforations, so he just sewed the man back up and hoped for the best. The patient died 3 days later, in absolute agony, as his abdominal cavity filled with infected blood and waste. Goodfellow's journal entry for that day simply reads, "Patient expired, cause unknown." Your basic understanding of germ theory would make you the most revolutionary medical practitioner of the 19th century. Your knowledge that washing hands prevents infection would save more lives than all the frontier doctors combined. The bottle of aspirin in your medicine cabinet contains more effective pain relief than anything available to frontier physicians. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of frontier life wasn't the physical dangers, it was what it did to people's minds. Let me tell you about Sarah McKenna, a school teacher from Boston who moved to a homestead in Nebraska in 1869. She kept a detailed diary, which was discovered in the 1960s in the walls of her abandoned cabin. Sarah was 23, intelligent, well-educated. She'd read Shakespeare and Dickens, could speak fluent French, played piano. The kind of person who'd probably be running a successful blog today, maybe working in marketing or journalism. The first entries in her diary are optimistic, even cheerful. She writes about the beautiful sunsets, the vast open sky, the sense of freedom and possibility. She describes her little cabin with affection, talks about planting a garden, maybe getting some chickens. But as the months pass, something begins to change in her writing. The nearest neighbors are 15 miles away. In winter, she might not see another human being for weeks at a time. The only sounds are wind, her own voice when she talks to herself, and occasionally, the howling of wolves or coyotes in the distance. By month 3, she's writing pages and pages about the weather. Not because anything interesting is happening, but because it's literally the only thing that changes from day to day. She starts ascribing personalities to the wind patterns, giving names to particularly fierce storms. By month 6, she's having full conversations with her furniture. Her diary entries become strange, fragmented. She writes about how the table is judging her, how the bed whispers to her at night, how the walls seem to be slowly closing in. She starts sleeping during the day and staying awake all night, because the darkness feels safer somehow. She stops washing regularly, stops changing clothes. Why bother? There's no one to see her. But here's where it gets really disturbing. She starts writing letters to people who don't exist. Long, detailed letters to imaginary friends, imaginary family members, even imaginary lovers. She describes elaborate social gatherings that exist only in her mind, detailed conversations that never happened. By month 10, her handwriting has become barely legible. The diary entries are rambling, paranoid. She's convinced that something is living in the walls of her cabin, watching her, waiting for her to fall asleep. She starts barricading the door at night, sleeping with a loaded shotgun. The last entry, dated February 14, 1870, is just one line repeated over and over again for 3 pages. They're coming through the walls. They're coming through the walls. They're coming through the walls. Sarah McKenna was found the following spring by a traveling preacher. She was sitting in the middle of her cabin, surrounded by months of her own waste, talking animatedly to empty chairs arranged around her kitchen table. She'd set places for 12 people and was serving imaginary tea to imaginary guests. She never recovered. She spent the rest of her life in an asylum in Lincoln, convinced that she was hosting an eternal dinner party for friends who existed only in her shattered mind. The human brain simply isn't designed for complete isolation. We're social creatures, and without regular human contact, our minds begin to unravel. The frontier was full of people like Sarah McKenna, homesteaders who'd gone prairie mad, miners who'd started talking to their pickaxes, trappers who'd forgotten how to speak to other humans. Your smartphone would have prevented this psychological breakdown. One text message, one phone call, one video chat would have provided the human connection necessary to maintain sanity. Your Instagram feed, annoying as it might be, represents more social interaction than most frontier settlers experienced in months. The isolation was so complete, so devastating, that suicide rates among frontier settlers were roughly 10 times higher than in established communities. And these weren't dramatic Hollywood-style suicides. They were quiet, desperate acts by people who'd simply run out of reasons to continue existing. Here's something that'll really put your financial worries into perspective. The actual economics of frontier life were absolutely insane. Let me break this down for you in terms you can understand. In 1875, a single apple cost about 50 cents. Doesn't sound like much, right? But in today's money, that's roughly $15. For one apple, a pound of sugar, basic sugar, cost $3, which translates to about $90 today. A pound of coffee was $4, or about $120 in modern currency. Most cowboys made about $30 a month, which is roughly $900 today. So imagine trying to live on $900 a month while paying $15 for an apple and $90 for a pound of sugar. But it gets worse. These prices were for goods that were actually available, which they often weren't. Supply chains in the frontier were absolutely chaotic. A merchant might receive a shipment of goods in spring and not see another delivery until the following year. This created a barter economy that was straight out of the medieval period. People would trade weeks of labor for a handful of nails. A good horse might cost the equivalent of a house in established settlements. A doctor's visit could bankrupt an entire family. And here's where it gets really dark. People would make economic decisions that seem insane by modern standards, because the alternative was death. Consider the case of the Moeller family, German immigrants who homesteaded in Kansas in 1878. They had 3 children under the age of 10 and had been surviving on basically nothing but cornbread and water for 6 months because they couldn't afford anything else. When their youngest child became seriously ill with pneumonia, they faced an impossible choice. They could afford either the doctor's fee or food for the rest of the family for the next month. Not both. They chose to pay the doctor. The child died anyway, frontier medicine being what it was, and the rest of the family spent the winter slowly, starving to death. The parents survived by eating their leather shoes and anything else they could find. 2 of the remaining children died of malnutrition before spring. Economic decisions like this were happening constantly throughout the frontier. Families would sell their children into indentured servitude rather than watch them starve. Parents would abandon sick or elderly family members because they couldn't afford to care for them. The Homestead Act promised free land, but it didn't. Mentioned that you needed roughly $2,000 in modern currency just to buy the basic tools necessary to work that land. Most families arrived at their homesteads with almost nothing and had to build everything from scratch while simultaneously trying not to starve. Your credit card would have made you one of the wealthiest people in the frontier. Your ability to order goods online and have them delivered would have been worth more than gold. Your access to modern banking, to insurance, to any kind of financial safety net would have been absolutely revolutionary. The frontier economy was essentially a massive pyramid scheme where everyone except the railroad companies and the largest cattle barons was slowly going broke. Most homesteaders failed within 5 years and had to abandon their land, often leaving behind graves of family members who didn't survive the attempt. Now let's talk about violence in the Wild West. Not the Hollywood gunfights and heroic showdowns. The real violence that happened every day and was so common that most of it wasn't even considered worth reporting. Domestic violence was essentially legal. A man could beat his wife, his children, his employees, and there were no legal consequences as long as he didn't kill them. And even then, juries were reluctant to convict a man for killing his own family members. But the violence went far beyond domestic abuse. The frontier was a place where might made right, and if you couldn't defend yourself physically, you were essentially prey. Take the town of Hays City, Kansas in 1869. Population, about 500 people. Number of murders that year, 37. That's a murder rate roughly 50 times higher than modern Detroit. But here's the thing. Those 37 murders were just the ones that got reported. Most violence in frontier towns happened in saloons, gambling halls, and brothels. And the owners of these establishments had strong incentives to keep things quiet. Bodies would simply disappear. A man would get into a fight over a card game, get stabbed in an alley, and his corpse would be dragged out to the prairie for the wolves. No investigation, no trial, often no one even bothering to identify the victim. The infamous Boot Hill cemeteries weren't romantic symbols of frontier justice. They were mass graves, where unidentified murder victims were dumped without ceremony. In Dodge City, Boot Hill contained over 100 graves, and fewer than 20 of them had headstones with actual names. Women had it even worse. Sexual assault was so common that it was rarely reported, and when it was, juries almost never convicted. A woman traveling alone was considered fair game by many men, and there was essentially no legal recourse. The concept of law enforcement was mostly a joke. Most frontier sheriffs were hired guns who were just as likely to commit crimes as prevent them. They were paid by local business owners to maintain order, which usually meant protecting property rather than people. Wild Bill Hickok, one of the most famous lawmen of the frontier, killed at least 7 men during his career as a sheriff. None of these killings were in fair fights or heroic showdowns. They were executions. Hickok would simply shoot anyone he considered a threat, often without warning. But perhaps most disturbing was how quickly civilized people adapted to this level of violence. Settlers who'd lived peaceful lives in established communities would arrive in frontier towns and, within months, would be carrying guns and making decisions about who lived and who died. Your modern understanding of human rights, of legal due process, of basic human dignity, would be completely alien to frontier settlers. Your reluctance to use violence to solve problems would be seen as a dangerous weakness that would get you killed. The frontier attracted the worst elements of American society: criminals fleeing prosecution, men running from debts or failed marriages, individuals who simply couldn't function in civilized society. These people formed the majority of the population in many frontier towns. Violence wasn't an exception in frontier life. It was the default state. Peace and safety were temporary aberrations that could shatter at any moment, usually over something as trivial as a card game or a misunderstood comment. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the real Wild West. The sun is setting over that dusty street in Dodge City, and you're probably feeling grateful for every modern convenience you normally take for granted. Your clean water, your antibiotics, your heated home, your smartphone that connects you to the entire world. All of these would have been considered miraculous by the people we've talked about tonight. Sarah McKenna, slowly going mad in her isolated cabin. She would have given anything for just one text message, one video call, one simple reminder that she wasn't alone in the universe. The Donner Party, trapped in those mountains, they would have traded all their remaining humanity for a GPS device that could have guided them safely to California. Dr. Goodfellow, watching his patients die from infections, he would have considered your bottle of aspirin more valuable than all the gold in the Comstock lode. The frontier wasn't conquered by brave heroes and noble pioneers. It was conquered by people who were often barely surviving, making impossible choices, adapting to levels of hardship that would break most modern minds. And yet they endured. Somehow, impossibly, many of them endured. They endured because they had no choice, because the alternative was death. Because when you strip away all the comforts and safety nets of civilization, what remains is a core of human stubbornness that simply refuses to quit. But you have choices they never dreamed of. You have safety they never knew. You have comfort that would have seemed like paradise to frontier settlers. Your biggest daily stress might be traffic jams or internet outages, or deciding what to watch on Netflix. Problems that wouldn't even register as problems to someone who'd lived through a frontier winter. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your clean, warm, safe bed, remember Sarah McKenna, slowly losing her mind in the Nebraska wilderness. Remember the Donner Party, making unthinkable choices in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Remember all those unnamed pioneers who lie in Boot Hill cemeteries, their stories lost to history. Remember them, and be grateful. Be grateful for your running water, for your electric lights, for your medicine cabinet full of miracle drugs that would have been considered magic 150 years ago. Be grateful for your connections, for your friends just a phone call away, for your family just a text message away, for a world where you're never truly alone, never truly isolated, never truly beyond help. Be grateful for your safety, for police who actually protect people, for hospitals that can heal you, for a society where violence isn't the default solution to every problem. Be grateful for your choices, for your freedom to leave if you don't like where you are, for your ability to change careers, to change cities, to change your entire life without risking death. The frontier is gone now. That harsh, unforgiving world where a broken bone could mean death, where isolation could drive you mad, where violence was as common as sunshine. It's been replaced by something softer, something kinder, something infinitely more humane. You live in paradise compared to the frontier settlers. You live in paradise, and you probably don't even realize it. So sleep well tonight, knowing that you're safe. Sleep well, knowing that help is always just a phone call away. Sleep well, knowing that you have choices, that you have options, that you have a future filled with possibilities that frontier settlers could never have imagined. Sleep well, and dream of electric lights, and running water, and all the, small miracles that make your life possible. Sleep well. You've earned it simply by having the incredible good fortune to be born in the right century. The frontier is dead, and you're alive, and that's the greatest victory of all. If you've survived this journey through frontier hell, you're tougher than most pioneers ever were. Smash that subscribe button for more historical nightmares that'll make you appreciate your boring modern life. Because tomorrow, I'm revealing why pirates actually hated gold, and what they preferred instead will absolutely crack you up. Click now and sleep like a well-fed, medically protected, socially connected legend. Sweet dreams, you magnificent survivor of the 21st century.